Confirm last sweep, Solar. Don't leave their shadows unmeasured, crackled a voice through the static-heavy comms channel. Ravik Solar barely glanced away from the flickering heads-up display stitched into the interior of his visor. Sweep, running. Their lanes are predictable, too predictable, he answered, his voice stripped of emotion, more a reading than a judgment. The scout vessel Nadir's Spear glided silently along the edge of Dominion territory. Around it, the fabric of space shimmered faintly with the barely perceptible trails of old cargo haulers, forgotten defense satellites, and the dry bones of ancient relay stations. The drone flotilla, trailing him, moved like cautious fish schooling in black water, their nav lights reduced to a dim pulse no brighter than a heartbeat. The human scout was under strict protocol, minimal emissions, no weapon locks, no broadcasts beyond a coded identification ping. His only shield was his neutrality, a soft beacon constantly transmitting his unarmed status in a sterile digital signature, like a lone light in an unlit desert. Ravik adjusted his course by a fractional vector, barely noticeable to the untrained eye. His fingers danced lightly across the control interfaces. No clunky mechanical clicks, only the soft flecks of adaptive materials reshaping to each movement. Sector sweep logs coming up, reported the tactical AI hero, embedded in the flight module. Ravik nodded, the muscles in his neck tight from long hours of unbroken stillness. The ship's interior smelled faintly of sealed polymer and filtered air, a cold scent stripped of all comfort, functional to the point of sterility. Through the forward viewing pane, a Dominion outpost spun slowly against the darkness, a massive skeletal ring, industrial veins crisscrossing its circumference, lights winking on its arms like the last flickers of a dying constellation. No defense grids active, no visible arms platforms powered. Too quiet, muttered Ravik under his breath. He toggled a discrete burst scan. Frequencies returned, distorted, like echoes shouting down broken hallways. His gloved hand tapped a command into the console. One of the scout drones peeled away, cutting a gentle arc around the station, its hull reflecting the cold sheen of distant stars. The display updated silently, no weapons locked, no anomaly pings, but movement caught his eye. On the underside of the station, slotted between derelict cargo spines, 4 small skiff-sized vessels, decoupled and drifted outward. Their paths were casual, lazy, until 3 of them corrected course sharply toward Ravik's flight pattern. No weapon locks activated, no alarm, yet Ravik knew the look of stalking. The radio crackled again. Solar, local authority pings requesting proximity confirmation. Recommend passive compliance. His jaw tight. Acknowledging, he said, killing the active scan pulses immediately and adjusting to a lower compliance-assigned drift speed. The ship's vibrational dampeners caught the minuscule shift of approaching mass. Those skiffs weren't just scanning, they were corralling. A metallic shudder reverberated through Nadir's Spear, not an impact, but the ghost of docking clamps brushing outer hull contours, feeling for purchase like blind hands. His pulse quickened, not from fear but from calculation. His duty was clear, no hostile action, no evasive maneuvers, unless directly fired upon. Earth's non-aggression charter, as cold as it was binding, left no room for improvisation. The lead skiff's docking ports flared, latching onto Nadir's Spear with a screech that resonated through the pilot couch's frame. Ravik kept his hands visible on the armrests. His voice, transmitted openly, was calm. Terran surveyor under non-aggression treaty compliance, standing by for inspection. No answer. Instead, a guttural language filled the wideband channels, the voice heavy, distorted Dominion dialect, formal but rough around the edges. Solar's translation overlay flickered. Authorization void. Vessel seizure approved. Neutral status revoked. The cockpit lights dimmed as external override attempts crawled through his ship's systems, spider-like tendrils of forced access signatures weaving into his command lines. Solar didn't move. His implants fed silent counter signals, defensive routines authorized only for data preservation, not self-defense. His vision blurred slightly at the edges, as the comms piped in Dominion boarding orders. His fingers tightened on the chair but didn't reach for the emergency boosters. Always compliance. Outside, drone feeds captured the skiff's umbilicals latching into place, hissing jets venting from misaligned ports. The external air smelled faintly, an edge of burnt coolant leaking in through micron gaps, like rust smeared across. From somewhere beyond the canopy, armored figures emerged, sleek black plates reflecting the faint trail lights from the nearest stars. Their helmets were expressionless, single-slitted visors cutting across polished domes. "Exit vessel," barked an external voice. Solar hesitated just long enough for protocol logs to timestamp his compliance response. He unsealed the cockpit with a hiss of reconditioned atmosphere, stepping into the boarding tube without resistance. As his boots hit the hard metal, Dominion guards snapped magnetic restraints onto his wrists with mechanical indifference. He was marched through the tight umbilical into the skeletal bowels of the skiff, the walls vibrating faintly with the rumble of internal systems flexing to accommodate their new prisoner. The smell inside was different, a rank cocktail of hydraulic fluids, ionized dust and something sweet rotting in hidden grates. Lights flickered inconsistently overhead, casting long black shadows that twisted and jittered along the wall. They moved him fast. No wasted gestures, no explanations. Solar kept his gaze fixed ahead. His training screamed at him to catalog every bolt pattern, every access hatch, every failure point. But this wasn't that kind of mission. He was data now, a message being couriered by hands that thought they held dominion over him. At the heart of the skiff, a cluster of Dominion officers gathered around a battered command dais, its displays flickering unevenly between readouts. One figure, taller than the rest, turned toward him, shoulders weighed down by ceremonial armor etched with fractal patterns of conquest. No words, a fist lashed out with brutal simplicity, catching Solar across the temple. Darkness crashed into him with the cold inevitability of gravity, and somewhere in the broken chorus of failing systems and hissing airlocks, the scout's silent beacon blinked one final time into the void. "Bring the Terran forward. Make them watch," barked the officer clad in ceremonial armor, voice sharp enough to cut through the clatter of skiff operations. Ravik, Solar, half-conscious, was dragged across the station's interior docking platform, boots scraping against the battered plating, his wrists, bruised and bloodied, strained against binding clamps. Two Dominion guards flanked him, neither bothering to conceal their disdain. Floodlights blazed alive above, throwing savage glares across the gathering. Civilians crowded the balconies, soldiers filled the outer catwalks, their helmets catching harsh reflections off laser plasma displays bolted crudely to the station bulkheads. Each screen mirrored a different angle. Ravik's bound figure, the officer's stance, the looming execution scaffold. The recycled air tasted like old rust and chemical sealant. Somewhere deeper in the station, fluid pumps moaned and coughed, struggling against decades of unchecked corrosion. Static buzzed from the public address channels, and then Dominion speaker Daewin Vask's voice cut across the crowd. "Behold, citizens of Zarn, Earth's coward, their spy, their broken emissary." Cheers roared up, drowning the stale echoes underfoot. From the corner of his blurred vision, Ravik caught a glimpse of one of the scout drones, still silently orbiting, too distant to intervene, its transmission beacon flashing muted distress, bursts into empty channels. "On your knees," snarled a guard, slamming the blunt end of a control pike into the back of his legs. Ravik dropped, the impact shooting white pain along his spine. A Dominion magistrate, draped in ritualistic sashes, stepped forward, holding an aged data slate, cracked at the edge. He read from it with a tone drained of any judicial pretense. "Ravik, Solar of Earth," the magistrate began, voice flat. "You stand accused of espionage, treaty violation and the undermining of Zarn's sovereignty. Sentence: immediate expiration." A low mechanical whine resonated through the platform as the execution scaffold powered on, coils warming to a dull orange. The executioner's helm reflected the shifting light, hiding any trace of humanity behind its angular features. Ravik lifted his head slightly. No defiance, no only the clinical acceptance of someone trained to expect the worst possibilities. Across the sector, feeds surged to life. Every public plaza, every troop barrack, every civilian hub, each now displayed the same chilling scene. Broken captions scrolled sluggishly under the images. "Witness the judgment of the Dominion." At the Terran outpost in the Ibram Fringe, a junior comms officer blinked at the unexpected feed popping up across their internal systems. "Sir," he muttered, "we're getting an authorized transmission." "It's Solar." Commander Orwin Thal leaned over the junior's shoulder, face grim as the frames flickered into brutal clarity. "Cut the feed," Thal ordered sharply. "Isolate it." But isolation wasn't possible. The Zarn had hardwired the feed into civilian emergency alerts, hijacking transmission bands humanity had no quick access to block. On the station's main scaffold, the executioner unslung a short staff-like weapon from his back, an archaic device with a crystalline emitter snarling with unstable energy. Not clean, not efficient, designed for maximum spectacle. The platform vibrated under Ravik's knees as the emitter's charge built. He watched without blinking. The officer overseeing the event raised a clenched fist. The emitter screamed into life, a thin shaft of blue-white fury snapping forward and driving straight through Ravik's chest. His body jerked, suspended for a moment in unnatural rigidity, before crumpling sideways like a puppet with its strings severed. The crowd's roar surged, echoed by hundreds of overlapping feed transmissions. From Earth's shadow observatories, analysts logged the event automatically. No commentaries, no anger, only timestamps, coordinates, silent digital confirmations. The broken body of Ravik Solar lay sprawled across the dock plating, a pool of dark, slow-moving blood seeping outward. One of the drone feeds continued broadcasting, catching a final frame of his still form before system overrides killed its connection. Commander Thal at the outpost grimaced, watching the feed fragment into broken packets. Status: full blackouts across Tsarn public frequency. They're burying the evidence already, the junior comms officer responded, hands flying across input arrays. In the background, the cold mechanical whir of air recyclers pressed against the silence gathering in the room. The camera drones aboard the Dominion station spun slowly, catching close-up shots of the dead human from multiple angles. Some civilians threw small metallic coins onto the platform in symbolic contempt. Others stood in silent triumph, arms crossed, their expressions unreadable under sharp lighting. The officer who had given the execution order stepped toward the body. He leaned down, grabbed Ravik's fallen identity beacon, and crushed it underfoot without ceremony. A sharp snap echoed across the docking bay. The beacon's destruction triggered a failsafe Earth's engineers had buried deep inside its code years before. Somewhere in neutral space, ancient devices stirred, a flicker here, a pulse there, each waking from decades of silence. But on the platform nothing changed. Not yet. A Dominion herald approached, carrying a battered portable transmitter. "Orders, my lord." The officer didn't bother turning. "Send a message across the sector. Let them know Earth is not invincible. We cut down their emissary. We are the ones who decide the terms now." The herald nodded stiffly, fingers flying over the transmitter's worn interface. A cold metallic taste lingered on the air, as if the station itself was tasting the blood spilt across its deck. Within minutes, the Dominion's triumphant announcement echoed across Tsarn's colonies and defense spheres, repeating Ravik Solar's name, labeling him a violator, a coward, a relic of a crumbling Earth civilization. Yet beneath the noise, deep inside abandoned sectors, no ship dared patrol. The first shardwake relays awakened, quiet, ancient, forgotten artifacts no longer content to sleep. Commander Thal narrowed his eyes at the last frozen image of Ravik Solar broadcast across their outpost's heads-up displays. "Not forgotten," Thal muttered under his breath, voice low enough that only the nearest tech heard him. A silent oath buried itself into the Terran command chain. No public outcry, no bombastic threats, only the quiet accounting of debts. The lights over Ravik's broken body dimmed briefly as the station power grid cycled erratically. No one noticed. But Earth had. And Earth remembered. "Confirm the anomaly. Sector grids off by 2 standard markers," barked Orwin Thal, leaning into the shifting data streams, stitched across his heads-up display. Technicians at the Terran Shadow Hub straightened in their stations, hands dancing over input fields. The command center breathed with muted urgency, recycled air sharp with the cold bite of disinfectant and old circuitry. "Initial scan negative for active threats," replied Systems Officer Varen Locke, his voice clipped, sharpened by uncertainty. Thal's gaze narrowed as another ripple distorted the layered surveillance feeds. Across dozens of sectors, tiny fluctuations coiled into patterns too subtle for ordinary diagnostics. Gravity wells pulsed softer, thermal blooms smoothed unnaturally across atmospheric bands. Communications bounced, splintered into shallow echoes without visible cause. "Run buried protocol sweeps," Thal ordered, tension pressing into his shoulders like invisible weights. "Layer deep archives." Keyword shardwake. The word, once inert code among millions, spilled across encrypted nodes like a slow-moving virus, in the skeletal remains of derelict freighters drifting along ancient trade routes. Hidden systems blinked alive. Glyphs once dormant under scabbed over paint flared, searing faint blue sigils against the corroded hulls. The nearest patrol stations noted the anomalies with bureaucratic indifference, filing sensor ghosts into low-priority archives, noise too minor to investigate. At the crumbling edge of the Zarn Dominion's contested sectors, an unmanned relay hub trembled, deep within its rusted core, buried under generations of hasty retrofits. A command shard liquefied and reformed. System control algorithms, alien to Dominion coding architecture, rewrote operational permissions in silent bursts of invisible logic. No sirens sounded, no alerts screamed. Only the taste of something shifting filled the cold corridors, a sterile, almost mineral flavor riding the filtered air. Back at Earth's shadow hub, the command floor vibrated faintly under the stabilizer's compensation systems. Officers adjusted without comment, instincts tuned by years of drilled readiness. Thal studied the latest telemetry. The heads-up display fractured the star maps into data layers, revealing thin threads weaving unseen across the sector, like veins long buried under hardened skin, suddenly pulsing with new life. Multiple initiations, staggered timings. Locke muttered, more to himself than anyone else. Not random. Nothing here is random, Thal countered, voice iron flat. In Sector Vale 9, a defunct satellite pretending to be a dead communications node rotated on a forgotten axis. Beneath its cracked housing, subroutines built like ancient clockwork gears, spun into motion. Low-frequency pulses, undetectable to standard scanning suites, began stitching hidden code through broadcast bands. Small Dominion patrol craft drifted unknowingly past the awakened devices, their sensors blinded by filters calibrated against Terran engineering centuries old. Every skiff, every station node, every data tower bore the faint fingerprints of Earth's abandoned treaties, subtle design compatibilities folded into structural norms no one had cared to question. In the control deck of Zarn's capital orbital, a Dominion technician frowned at a momentary flicker across his primary systems board. Static ghosted his laser plasma displays, a thin frost of digital snow he brushed aside with an annoyed tap. Behind him, auto-diagnostic reports filed false positives into archive bins faster than human review could catch. A shardwake relay, long disguised as a cargo debris marker, completed its handshake with the local power grid. No alarms were triggered. Instead, minor efficiency upgrades flashed approval logs. Power reroutes optimized flows through suggested pathways, shaving seconds off normal transmission rate. The Dominion officer assigned to maintenance signed off the improvements without reading the details, thinking only of the slight bonus credits such efficiencies grant. Above the sector's minor gas mining moons, abandoned orbital frames hidden within refinery skeletons twitched, microservos locking into new alignment protocols, antennae turning imperceptibly to catch dying transmission embers scattered across the void. Orwin Thal watched the growing network topology light up across his console, each node a cold star in a constellation Earth had drawn decades earlier. Lines connecting across forgotten paths no one had ever realized were drawn by Terran hands. We're watching it now, Locke said quietly. But they won't. They can't, Thal answered. His fingers hovered over a silent command strip, not to interfere but to acknowledge. Shardwake doesn't announce itself. The command center's recycled atmosphere tasted increasingly dry, the byproduct of air scrubbers burning hotter to maintain system load. The faint vibration of recalibrating stabilizers deepened into a structural bass hum that pressed against the soles of boots unnoticed except by those who understood such things. Across Zarn-controlled worlds, minor anomalies continued. Cargo manifests derailed by split-second delay, docking permissions overridden by phantom authorizations, water purification plants reporting fractional flow inversions, so small they registered as clerical errors. Yet cumulatively, the pressure built. 1,000 microfractures spiderwebbed under the Dominion's infrastructure, unseen, unremarked, inevitable. In the dim underbelly of an orbital manufacturing hub, an engineer noticed an odd glyph, pulsing faintly on a sealed maintenance panel. Curious, he touched it with a gloved hand. The panel hissed open, revealing a maintenance crawlway dense with conduits. Shrugging, he filed a minimal maintenance request and moved on. Shardwake systems logged the biometric acknowledgement, confirming Dominion acceptance of the altered maintenance grid. Another authorization slip, another gate opened. The glyphs shimmered and faded, invisible once more. At Earth's monitoring outpost, Thal exhaled slowly through his nose, steady and deliberate. Advancement rate, he asked, never raising his voice. 22% sector bleed, doubling every 12 minutes, Locke answered, eyes flicking across shifting graphs. Dominion reaction remains non-existent. Thal allowed the faintest trace of a smile to touch the corners of his mouth. Not victory, only the grim acknowledgement that inevitability had taken root. In the corner of the operations bay, the mission clock flicked forward. Another standard cycle. Soft beeps marked the passage of cold time, utterly indifferent to the human meanings imposed upon it. Shardwake relays pulsed again, gentle, methodical, each new activation folding another Dominion system into Earth's silent architecture. Outside the command window, stars gleamed icily against the black, utterly unaware, utterly Inside, Orwin Thal turned to Locke, voice low enough only the walls heard. It begins. No fanfare, no warning, only the quiet snapping of invisible chains tightening, link by link, around an empire too arrogant to notice they were already bound. Power lattice recalibrating sublayer variance detected, intoned a mechanical voice across Outpost Varnok's main control deck. No officers responded. Heads-up displays blinked in irregular patterns, colors bleeding along fractured data streams. In the bowels of the structure, power conduits once reliable as bedrock vibrated under unseen pressures, faint oscillations rattling loose the composite dust caked along access grates. An emergency systems monitor, positioned near a maintenance hatch, began to stutter, heartbeat icons flashing, then failing altogether. The cooling systems, once steady as a tide, sighed a low mechanical death rattle, leaving an uncomfortable dampness clinging to the station's walls. The scent of overheated polymers crept into the recycled air, unnoticed by those scrambling for system overrides. In docking sector B-17, a small cluster of maintenance drones lost orientation mid-flight. Their stabilizers spammed as magnetic fields warped along twisted relay corridors. One struck a loading crane, crumpling like brittle paper, scattering tiny mechanical components across the deck. Another spiraled upward, carving jagged trails into the overhead lighting fixtures before collapsing in a shower of fractured plastic and inert circuitry. Far above, the orbital platform Zephon Cradle registered marginal power anomalies, barely enough to merit a warning flag. Automation protocols initiated standard isolation sequences, redundant relay shutoffs, battery backups rerouted. A technician half asleep in a monitoring chair marked the report with a bored acknowledgement, eyes drooping toward the laser plasma display's flickering perimeter logs. Deep within the station's heart, however, the shardwake-coated threads continued weaving, tightening around core systems like vines choking the last life from a tree. At Zarn's mid-sector power substation, Argith 3, cooling towers began fluctuating temperature cycles in broken rhythm. The turbines whined under misaligned load distribution, vapor plumed against cracked viewports, draping the interior in thin veils of condensed mist that carried an acrid, almost sweet bitterness. On the civilian levels, lighting panels dimmed without warning. Emergency systems attempted seamless takeovers, flickering halfway before entire zones plunged into oppressive darkness. In the markets clustered around Subdeck 9, shop owners cursed, throwing power switches in vain as food preservation units blinked offline, the faint wet slap of thawing goods filling the heated stalls. Somewhere beneath, where the grid's roots coiled deepest, relay nodes swapped identities with archived ghost sectors. Command hierarchies looped through non-existent references, issuing orders to systems long since stripped for parts. The resulting feedbacks amplified silently, like ripples spiraling into a whirlpool no one could see. In an administrative hub overlooking the sector's orbital tethers, an operations overseer punched error codes into an unresponsive console. His gloves left smudged trails on the cracked touch surface. Behind him, backup generators coughed once, stuttered, then fell silent as core power was siphoned into recursive fail-safe loops, built not by Zarn hands but by patient Terran design. No alarms sounded, the programming silenced them at source. The only noises now were the small ones, the reluctant hiss of trapped air bleeding from microfractures, the stutter of misfiring servos, the thrum of environmental controls slipping in and out of synchron. From a maintenance access shaft high above, a drone mechanic noticed an emergency beacon pulsing a sequence he didn't recognize. Curious, he climbed toward it, boots scraping along ladder rungs, slick with condensation. As he reached for the beacon, it short-circuited under his toe. A flash of blinding white snapped across the shaft, and the man fell backward into the darkness without a sound, the fall swallowed by the maze of hollow maintenance corridors. Shardwake did not operate with violence. It operated with inevitability. In Transport Hub Vedra, an automated tram glided smoothly along its guideway, until its AI controller, infected by fractured command inputs, rerouted its track into a maintenance access tunnel sealed decades prior. The first impact sheared open the tram's exterior like a ripe fruit, scattering debris in a lazy arc across abandoned platforms. Above the surface station's satellite relays responsible for weather modulation blinked into diagnostic modes without operator command. Without atmospheric dispersal controls, localized storms brewed unchecked, hammering down sheets of water, and violent gusts that twisted supply towers until their joints groaned under unnatural strain. At Outpost Varnock, the main command lattice finally fractured. A keystone data server, its casing warped under sudden thermal shifts, sent a final desperate system-wide alert, a distorted screech across internal channels, more instinct than message. Every laser plasma display on the command deck burst into chaotic data swarms, text layering over video feeds in corrupted glyphs no technician could parse. Maintenance supervisors hammered override panels, their fingers bloody from repeated attempts to bypass failure log. The deck's surface grew slick underfoot, a mixture of condensation and something darker, thicker, dripping from ruptured conduit arteries along the overhead support. Outside the outpost's reinforced windows, the energy fields that once shimmered soft and protective now flickered, writhing in unstable oscillations like dying solar flares, struggling to survive the void's indifference. A drone dispatched to recalibrate the external power relays never completed its mission. Surveillance footage later archived, never reviewed, showed the drone spinning helplessly out of control, swallowed by its own stabilization field collapsing inward. Shardwake had crossed critical mass. Every procedural safety, every reactive measure, every redundancy designed by the Zarn engineers had already been weaponized against them. Their own fallback systems now clawed at foundational protocols, shredding data integrity at the atomic level of code. By the time central authorities attempted sector-wide resets, those channels no longer responded. Hard resets tripped cascading failures across auxiliary lines, severing isolated systems that by Terran design had long since lost true independence. The Dominion's sector grid sagged under its own corrupted weight, struggling to maintain cohesion. What once had been orderly pulses of power now jittered into frantic, disjointed surges, overloading stabilization capacitors one by one. The first station, Outpost Varnock, went completely dark at 0300 Standard Time. No evacuation orders transmitted, no final reports archived, only a long, drawn-out sigh as the outpost's superstructure folded inward on itself, extinguishing hundreds of lives in a muted collapse that rippled no outward warning. Only a faint distortion across Terran monitoring screens, noted, recorded and archived without comment. Shardwake had only just begun. "Stabilize the grid now, or everything spirals," shouted Tormek Rhine, his voice splitting the command deck's rising clamor. Control towers across Sector Vedra flickered with overlapping emergency overlays. Every heads-up display bled crimson warnings, symbols cascading faster than crew could swipe them away. Rhine's hands, calloused from decades of shipwright work, slammed override commands into the console, codes spooled out in blurring streams. He barked fresh orders to stabilization crews still upright, while half the room scrambled to reset internal relays surging dangerously toward meltdown. Above Varnock's ruins, orbital regulators spun wildly out of position, casting violent magnetic distortions across nearby satellites. Power coupling fields buckled, sparks showered docking platforms, as overloaded capacitor vanes ruptured under the invisible pressure. A heavy chemical tang seeped into breathing circuits, the bitter ghost of insulation breakdown. On substation Ravik 4, a maintenance supervisor watched in disbelief, as every reactor monitor jittered between green and red statuses within heartbeats. He pounded emergency isolation sequences into the primary relay board. The system acknowledged, then froze mid-execution, stuck in a looping authorization request to phantom nodes no longer part of the network. "Hard cutoffs aren't working," he muttered, sweat stinging his eyes. In response, the station's emergency lighting stuttered, plunging entire maintenance sectors into choking darkness. Somewhere in the black, a coolant main ruptured with a sickening pop, hissing thick clouds of vapor that stank of chemical solvent. Sector Command initiated a full-spectrum recalibration across the Dominion's operational lattice. The result was catastrophic. Secondary fusion cores, straining to pick up dead loads, began eating themselves alive. Feedback loops designed to contain minor fluctuations escalated into systemic thermal runaways. Visual monitors caught containment walls shuddering, faint spiderweb cracks fanning outward with each microquake of shifting internal stresses. Inside Tetherpoint Halcyon, a transit platform binding multiple orbital tethers, autonomous cargo haulers spun out of synchronization. One barreled into an upper-deck logistics hub at lethal velocity, a tumbling mass of shattered alloys and burning cargo spewing into corridors thick with smoke and screaming proximity alarms. Back on Rhine's flagship operations bridge, stabilization matrices reeled under data inputs too corrupted to parse. Heads-up displays flared white, force rebooted and then poured endless strings of incomprehensible system failures onto once-ordered dashboard. Technicians ripped off interface gloves as static discharges crawled along terminals, stinging exposed skin with sharp, biting jolts. Acrid heat bloomed from panel seams, staining the air with the stinging bite of scorched wiring jacket. Tormek Rhine's gaze snapped to the primary power schematic now folding itself into unreadable geometry. He knew without needing confirmation, the lattice wasn't broken. It had been rewritten. Desperate to regain control, Rhine ordered full command lockdowns, sector-severing commands that would normally amputate infected nodes to save critical cores. Instead, the commands reversed mid-transmission, crashing headfirst into shardwake countermeasures buried too deep for recognition. In Hydrax Platform 12, an agricultural station orbiting Zarn's breadbasket colony, fertilizer mixers seized up, dumping tons of unstable ammonia compounds into closed ventilation systems. Crew abandoned the decks within minutes, faces streaked with burns, choking on tainted air no scrubbers could clear. Elsewhere, backup AI cores initiated what should have been controlled restart. Instead, the artificial minds flickered into fragmented self-erasure, crumbling under impossible recursive command chains. Maintenance bots, stripped of supervisory logic, spiraled into random task loops, clogging critical transit corridors with their own confused wreckage. From high orbit, external drones watched whole power sectors shimmer, flicker and blacken like dead embers snuffed by an unseen hand. Commander Vask aboard a Dominion security cruiser, observed in mounting horror, as automated warnings consumed the bridge's tactical display. No single point of attack, no visible invader, only systems cannibalizing themselves with mechanical ruthlessness. He slammed a comms patch through to Tech Chief Rhine, voice ragged. Lockdowns failing, we're bleeding power at a planetary scale. Rhine wiped sweat from his forehead, feeling the sting of salt against cracked skin. Strip it down to cores, cut life support if you have to, save the grid. But the Dominion's infrastructure no longer recognized their own authority. Critical reactor fields collapsed inward, secondary shields flickering into unstable surges, frying command lines in showers of blue-white sparks. One by one, command nodes went silent. On Laskry Station, engineers armed with old-world override modules tried to bypass internal safeties. They worked by gloved hand, rerouting energy flow along ancient copper core links forgotten beneath modern upgrades. For a breath it seemed to work. Consoles blinked green. Then the shardwake protocol rolled over the adaptations like a suffocating tide. The copper lines glowed cherry red, bursting open conduits that vented superheated air in lethal jets. Crew within proximity didn't even have time to scream. In the stratosphere, Dominion communications arrays began collapsing into gravity wells unchecked, raining debris across critical relay zones, carving fire trails through the thin atmosphere that painted streaks of ruin visible to any who looked skyward. Tormek Rhine refused to step back from the chaos. His station shook under the pressure of failing compensators, emergency grav controls struggling to maintain minimal equilibrium. An operator shouted across the din, voice barely piercing the shriek of overstrained servo notes. "We've lost the Krydex line." That was... The feed cut to static. Rhine hammered his fists into the console, feeling bones rattle inside his sleeves. He triggered one last command, an ancient kill switch buried in core systems, manual reactor vent. For 3 agonizing seconds, the heads-up displays responded. Vents cycled, relief, sharp and desperate, flashed across the bridge crew's exhausted faces. Then shardwake corrupted the venting protocols mid-cycle, feeding them directly back into coolant suppression units. Containment fields folded like paper under hurricane winds. Across multiple worlds and stations, core reactors overpressured, flash flooding energy into channels never designed to carry such force. The walls vibrated with a sound too low to hear, a pressure felt through organs rather than ears, a final desperate groan of infrastructure meeting its engineered doom. Tormek Ryan watched the first control tower split apart from the command bridge viewport, its spires falling like broken fingers against a sickly green sky. Failure was no longer a threat. Failure had become absolute. "Deploy sector isolation's full burn protocols," roared Warlord Jaskordvel, voice cutting through the battered command carrier's bridge. Like a serrated blade, around him senior officers bent over fractured heads-up displays, punching in shield algorithms, bleeding static across input fields, tactical diagrams fragmented under their fingers, red overlays collapsing into jagged monochrome fractures. Orbital Command Citadel Kreen, Vel's last fortress hub, shook under the weight of unseen failures threading up from deep system roots. Coolant vapors hung low along the deck plates, giving the floor a slick, frost-bitten sheen that bit against exposed boots. Vel straightened, fists clenched behind his back. Every muscle in his frame radiated tension, the kind honed not from panic but from years of surviving, when panic killed lesser men. "Hard isolation cuts. We sever compromised grids before they compromise us." Control Officer Brandveric nodded grimly, his face a patchwork of fatigue and iron will. He barked into comlinks, straining to hold a coherent signal. "Priority Kappa 3. All perimeter stations isolate main nodes. Immediate execution." Across the network, battered defense satellites pivoted, realigning shield projectors toward the edges of their designated airspace. Ground-based relay stations pushed stabilization capacitors into overdrive, aiming to wall off Dominion holdings behind a storm of energized barriers. For a heartbeat it seemed the tide might slow. In the upper decks of the Citadel, soldiers scrambled to haul heavy shielding cores into recalibration cradles. Sparks burst along gantry arms as misaligned shielding plates clanged into place, the echo rising like the frantic toll of a death bell through the fortified structure. Orbital viewports cast brutal angles of shattered platforms, spinning adrift in the near atmosphere, broken lights trailing behind them like the tails of dying comets. A systems officer monitoring the shield network's convergence let out a ragged gasp as her console vomited streams of corrupted targeting data. "Sir, shield isolations are cycling back into us." Vel turned slowly toward her, his voice a dangerous whisper. "Explain." "The grids are reversing. The isolation fields aren't pushing threats out. They're folding inward, drawing external destabilizations into our internal network lines." Her words landed like hammer blows across the bridge. Outside the Citadel, high-orbit shielding bands once designed to deflect solar particle storms inverted polarity. Without warning, instead of forming protective barriers, they focused stress inward, compressing vulnerable structures already hemorrhaging stability. From the planetary surface, civilians looked skyward and saw the heavens ripple, not with defensive shield brilliance, but with shimmering collapse waves descending like spectral hammer. Military logs timestamped the failures with brutal efficiency. 0312, Standard, Kryn's secondary shield grid reports alignment success. 0313 Standard, Grid inverts. 0314 Standard, Shield harmonics amplify failure feedback. Overloading stabilization circuits. 0315 Standard, Grid self-destructs, vaporizing 5 orbital tethers. Jaskordvel didn't flinch as the first shield failure rolled across Sector Ravik, flattening control towers in crackling curtains of uncontrolled radiation. "Seal the Citadel," he barked. His voice carried a sharpness that forced immediate compliance, even from men already moving. Titanium blast shutters groaned into position over external ports. The deck plates trembled beneath the strain of overlapping environmental failure. Power regulators screamed through overloaded conduits, the sound vibrating through the soles of every soldier's boots. Tactical Officer Fennec Drahl reported between gasping breaths. Orbital anchor fields lost on Citadel perimeters. Platforms drifting uncontrolled. Vel crushed the status readout into a ball of crumpled polymer, tossing it aside without looking. "Shift defense focus internal," he growled. "Protect core command. Everything else is already gone." Around the Citadel's lower strata, maintenance drones tried futilely to reseat gravitational anchors snapping one by one. The mechanical shrieks of metal buckling under inverted mass fields echoed through empty service corridors like wailing banshee. Beyond the reinforced observation decks, 2 orbital stations collided in a slow, grotesque dance. Frames folded into each other, spitting burning debris trails that carved phosphorescent scars across the night sky. Emergency jettison crafts spiraled outward, some catching secondary explosions, their fuselages flaring briefly before extinguishing against the high-altitude darkness. Inside the Citadel, every surface seemed to hum with restrained fury. Sweat pooled along the collars of crew suits. The recycled air carried the sterile tang of burnt wiring, punctuated by occasional gusts of superheated coolant venting behind failing bulkheads. The command bridge shrank inward under the growing pressure of unavoidable collapse. Jaskordvel stared at the laser plasma display, reading the final sectors lost, sector after sector blinking out without resistance, as if erased by a silent, unseen hand. "New plan," he said, voice low but steady. "Anchor the Citadel to planetary mass lock. Even if we lose orbit, we dig into ground stabilization hardpoints." Technicians rushed to obey, slamming in override sequences, rerouting reactor power into ground anchor arrays buried deep in the planetary crust. Initial readings flashed green. For 8 seconds, Shardwake, now fully entangled with the Dominion's infrastructure, adapted again. Planetary mass locks triggered microseismic events, small at first, almost imperceptible, a gentle shudder along structural seams. Then the quakes began to stack. Support columns groaned under shifting tectonic loads. Interior walls spider-webbed with fractures that widened visibly by the minute. Docking clamps sheared from their moorings, hurling unattended transport skiffs into the Citadel's upper tier. Commander Ravik, bracing against the failing gravity control, locked eyes with Vel. "No more fallback plans, sir," he said grimly. Vel didn't argue. The Dominion's strength had always been its command discipline, its belief in organized force overwhelming chaos. Now chaos moved faster, thought deeper, and used their own systems as levers to tear the Dominion apart from within. A final seismic jolt ripped through the Citadel. The heads-up displays died. The observation decks shattered outward. In the far corner of the command bridge, a command banner representing Dominion sovereignty collapsed from its moorings, falling into the flames crawling hungrily up the walls. Jaskordvel stood rigid against the storm, the stubborn, bitter silhouette of a warlord watching the last empire he would ever command dissolve into smoke. "Get me a live channel, anything still breathing," barked Dalen Vagues, slamming his palm against the fractured relay console. The broadcast tower shuddered under another invisible blow, the deck vibrating with sharp, unpredictable twitches that made the walls groan under their own weight. The air was heavy with ionized residue, not a scent but a pressure, sliding thickly over the tongue. Static bled into the command frequency like a slow hemorrhage. Vagues hunched over the cracked interface, fingers tracing emergency activation glyphs, as warning sirens staggered into a discordant cacophony behind him. Heads-up displays stitched jagged red arcs across the control room, signal strength indicators collapsing like dying embers against the cold sweep of cascading system failures. A junior tech stumbled through the smoke-wreathed threshold, carrying a field generator cradled against his chest. "Backup ready, sir," he rasped, voice raw from breathing recycled air laced with scorched plastics. "Patch it straight to the spine," Vask snapped. "No filters, no rebinders, pure carrier wave." The tech obeyed, slamming the generator into the auxiliary socket with a jarring hiss. The power surge snapped across the main comms console, lifting every hair on Vask's arms with static discharge. He tasted the faint iron bite of blood from a split lip he hadn't noticed during the earlier impact. Laser plasma displays staggered into flickering life, one by one, ghostly figures rendered in unstable frames. Vask leaned into the cracked comm pickup, voice scraping through the flickering channel. "This is Dalen Vask, Dominion High Broadcast Authority. Sector command failure confirmed. Civilian grids compromised. Requesting full-spectrum emergency reinforcement." Silence met him, thick and unnerving, like shouting into an abandoned temple. He cycled frequencies manually, pushing the signal through fallback transmission bands meant for planetary evacuation alerts. Each attempt sparked brief life, faint echoes of distant distress pings, then collapsed into choking static. Across the burning skyline, the skeletal remains of a broadcast relay tower trembled. Blue-white energy arcs licked up its frame, snapping guy wires taut before vaporizing them one by one. Dalen's throat tightened. He switched to direct transmission bursts, hard pinging every known substation and orbital platform. His fingers burned from the heat bleeding up through the failing equipment, blisters forming beneath fraying gloves. Each burst carried fragments. An image here, A garbled voice there, chopped into unintelligible splinters by a network folding itself into oblivion. Multiple grid failures, systematic, repeating patterns. Vesk muttered into the recorder. Unidentified sabotage protocols, non-local origin suspected. Outside the command bay, distant explosions painted the sky in violent reds and sickly greens. Dust billowed against the observation panels, scratching with dry whispering sounds that raised gooseflesh along Dalen's spine. He toggled the signal amplifier to maximum, bypassing automatic safety governors. The tower's transmission lattice howled in protest, panels warping under the unnatural strain. "Command to surviving units," he said, voice steady despite the quakes rattling the deck beneath his boot. "Do not trust internal systems. Manual fallback only. Prioritize survival over defense grids. No acknowledgement, not even dead air, only stuttering distortion, as if the void itself had learned to mock the sound of hope." A sudden jolt flung Dalen sideways against a bulkhead. He caught himself on a sparking rail, skin peeling along his knuckles in rough tears. Blood smeared the interface as he dragged himself upright. The junior tech screamed from somewhere deep in the control cluster, a brief sound cut short by a deafening cascade of collapsing server banks. The stench of burning composites thickened, coating the back of Dalen's throat with greasy residue. He activated the last functional beacon, a jury-rigged emergency transmitter welded into place by exhausted engineers with little left to lose. A thin, wavering signal pushed outward, clawing through the failing atmosphere. Dalen forced a breath through gritted teeth and spoke. "This is Dominion Emergency Broadcast Echo 9. Collapse in progress. No aid expected. Systems corrupted. Civilian shelters compromised. We are. The feed crackled, words fragmenting into broken syllables that flickered in and out like dying fireflies. Loss. Grid bleed. Unsustainable. Sector. Fall. The tower above him split with a thunderous shriek, an eruption of searing light ripping through the framework. Energy cascaded downward, arcs clawing at every surface, igniting secondary fires across the comm floor. Dalen staggered toward the manual breaker, trying to kill the signal cleanly, to at least leave behind a clear final warning. Before he could reach it, the last active relay core detonated inward. A bloom of heat slammed into him, throwing him across the room. The world flipped sideways, then blurred into a heavy, choking darkness. For a moment, he thought he heard the transmitter still pulsing, a desperate heartbeat too stubborn to quit. But it was only the final echo of the system's death throes. In orbit, the remnants of transmission towers blinked erratically, one by one, their beacons extinguished as cascading system collapses raced ahead of every attempt at recovery. Across Sector Vadra and beyond, emergency broadcast repeaters looped static. The last message captured on Dominion emergency archives was incomplete. "Mockery cost us the stars." Then nothing. Nothing but the slow, stuttering pulse of abandoned satellites tumbling through the broken sky, their faint lights winking out as Shardwake's ghost signals unraveled the final fibers of Dominion communication. The silence was not peace. The silence was death marching unseen across every open frequency, consuming every shout, every cry for help, every final prayer. Dalen Vesk's name, like the names of so many others, disappeared into the void with no monument, no remembrance, only the faint signature of a broken transmission still wandering, alone into endless night. "Mark final pulse sequence, across remaining nodes," said Orwen Thal, his voice slicing through the quiet operations bay like a drawn wire. Operators moved briskly behind heads-up displays, their faces awash in the cold glow of dying star charts. Every station hummed with low-frequency computation tones, a living symphony of machines cataloging extinction without ceremony. Above the Terran observation hub, the stars gleamed without warmth, scattered like shards across the endless black. Sector Vidra's networked constellation, once a spiderweb of artificial light and orbital saturation, now unraveled before them frame by measured frame. Thal stood before the primary viewport, hands folded behind his back, boots planted firm against the trembling subdeck. His gaze held steady as the last Dominion orbital relay spun out of its path, trailing ruptured antennae and severed shield nodes, like shredded wings. Across the master tactical layer, Dominion infrastructure collapsed in cascading waves. Thermal decay signatures rose, peaked and fell away like dying heartbeats. Sensor arrays captured the disintegration in forensic detail, oxygen fires blooming along failed pressure seals, reactor cores shedding containment in slow, luminous breaches. No command orders were issued. None were needed. From a secondary feed, sector maps bled from gold to gray, as beacon markers winked out one by one. Each blink was acknowledged with a silent data packet archived for post-event verification. Each loss was simply logged, a quiet eulogy written not with mourning, but with sterile accuracy. The filtered air inside the command bay carried a sterile chill, tinged faintly with the sharpness of recycled compounds, maintaining the fragile pocket of human life amid the wider depth. On his right, Data Officer Sarek Darn leaned closer to a failing monitor, fingers moving in crisp sequences over tactile input pads, transmission remnants declining exponentially, he noted without inflection. Last Dominion emergency beacon projected to fail within standard rotation cycle. Thal offered no reply. His reflection floated across the viewport glass, a sharp figure outlined against the backdrop of ruin. A low structural creak whispered through the frame supports overhead, as gravitational anomalies from orbital wreckage stirred local space. The debris fields that formed twisted patterns of broken alloys and frozen bodies rotated lazily, fragments of once great fortresses now reduced to drifting memorials. In the lower left corner of the master feed, a relay beacon sputtered weakly, sending jagged bursts of corrupted data into nothingness before succumbing to darkness. Orwin Thal watched the final transmission, a single code string repeating on fragmentary loops, mangled into illegibility by cascading errors. No voice, no identity, only the dying gasp of a lost civilization folding in on itself. Over Sector Vidra's planetary belts, once bright defensive rings fractured, their skeletal remains scattering like dry leaves before unseen winds. Isolated cities suffered rolling blackouts as Dominion planetary cores lost synchronization, their synthetic dawns extinguished without fanfare. The operations deck smelled faintly of heated polymers from overworked sensor relays, the only betrayal of stress within the Terran systems designed for prolonged silent observation. A heads-up alert scrolled along Thal's peripheral vision. Dominion Command Nexus. Signal loss confirmed. He blinked once, registering the finality, and then returned his focus to the wider tableau. Orbital stabilizers destabilized into decaying spirals, pulling construction stations into sluggish death falls toward the now darkened planetary surfaces. Sensors recorded kilometer-long infrastructure frames rending open along fault lines, spilling plumes of broken alloys and shattered composites that caught the dying light like glittering dust clouds. Behind Thal, systems monitor Corvas called out with quiet efficiency. Cross-sector containment collapse confirmed. Total signal black at all tertiary nodes. Thal tapped an acknowledgement against the authorization strip embedded into his command console, fingerprinting the event for audit. No celebration rippled through the Terran observation hub. No speeches rang out. There was only the methodical execution of silent accounting. The command floor's ambient lighting dimmed fractionally to compensate for the reduced energy load as Dominion frequencies faded into irrelevance. From an external cam view stitched across the side monitors, the orbital debris cloud's shape became visible to the naked eye. A slow coiling serpent of shattered hulls, broken reactors, severed arms of abandoned satellites and dead ships adrift in a dance of mutual annihilation. No salvage crews would come for them. No memorials would be raised in their honor. Only the cold, endless decay of forgotten defeat. Thal's hand hovered over the command acknowledgement key for a breath longer than necessary, then descended in a single decisive motion. From deep within the Terran infrastructure, preceded archival systems triggered, capturing the full collapse for future record. No signal was sent to the Dominion. No ultimatum broadcast. No offer of surrender terms. Their silence was answer enough. In the corner of the viewport, a Dominion battle standard, still affixed to a collapsing orbital citadel, fluttered briefly in the vacuum before tearing free, spinning into the growing wreckage cloud. Thal's voice broke the silence only once more. Mark sector designation Vidra, neutralized. Behind him, operators recorded the command without comment, sealing it into immutable Terran archives. The data sweep continued, cataloging the death of an empire down to its final electron. The observation platform's subtle stabilizers compensated for minor gravitational drift as the orbital plane shifted with the slow fall of shattered moons and crumbling ring structures, the debris fields knitting together into broken halos around the dead worlds below. As Sector Vidra passed from recorded status into a sterilized historical notation, Earth's operational command simply moved on, monitoring the next silent layers of influence planted long before any Dominion general had dreamed of conquest. The lights on the tactical displays faded from active red to static gray. There were no survivors flagged for extraction, no distress calls demanding Terran attention, only cold silence, perfectly catalogued. Orwenthal stood unmoving as the last Dominion relay lost power and drifted into blankness, a small point of light extinguished by an ancient patience few civilizations ever feared until it was far too late. "Trigger the relay," said Orwenthal, voice low, steady, final. Across the Terran observation platform, operators moved as if underwater, slow and deliberate, every gesture heavy with irreversible weight. Heads-up displays bloomed with automated prompts as the last sequence initialized. Outside the reinforced glass, Sector Vedra hung silent and broken. A graveyard spun in quiet rotation. In the ruined belts below, Dominion cities, once arrogant with towering spires, lay shattered. Dust storms churned through skeletal remains, grinding twisted alloys into powder. Orbital hulls split open, gaping like the carcasses of ancient leviathans abandoned in a dead sea. No voices called out from the rubble, no signals fought against the silence. Earth's last message waited, embedded deep within the shardwake lattice, dormant until confirmation of total collapse. Now it moved. Over the fractured remains of outposts and dead battlecruisers, surviving monitors, stripped of coherent data streams, flickered once, then stabilized into a single image. Earth's emblem, stark against black, silent as a tombstone. Across what was left of the Dominion's control decks, cracked floors littered with shattered helmets, snapped banners trailing like forgotten flags, the message pulsed into being. In the cracked remains of Citadel Kryn's command bridge, amid drifting ash and sparking wires, the broadcast ignited the last working projector. Static flared, then hardened into sharp surgical clarity. The words played across every surviving surface, delivered not by voice, but by the cold certainty of unchallenged truth. "You mocked our scout, now your empire is dust." No embellishment, no apology, only the pure, brutal finality of fact. Below the shattered orbital lanes, planetary crusts heaved under stress fractures, unleashed by shardwake sabotage. Cities buckled into sinkholes, structures designed to defy gravity surrendered, folding into themselves like flowers crushed beneath a boot. The broken remains of the Dominion's fleet, caught in decaying orbital paths, began falling in earnest. Pieces struck atmosphere, trailing molten scars across the twilight sky, burning themselves into oblivion. Each impact thudded into the planet's broken skin, a muffled drumbeat heralding the end of a civilization that had once crowned itself invincible. From the observation deck, Orwenthal watched without speaking, his breath frosted against the viewport glass, unnoted. At his side, Systems Officer Kor Vass recorded the final sequence, expression blank, hands moving mechanically across input arrays, slick with the chill of processed air. No Terran vessel moved to occupy the dead sector. No transmission followed the message. Dominion colonies on the outskirts, those too small, too isolated to have joined the central grid, received the broadcast on battered emergency bands. Farmers, miners, old veterans, all watched the words unfurl in cold silence, understanding too late what the warning meant. Panic rose across those fringe worlds, too late to matter. They sent bursts into the black, desperate, pleading transmissions, promising loyalty, tribute, anything. The Shardwake network absorbed them without reply. In the command archive chamber, the sector's timeline updated its final entry: Vedra, terminated, non-recoverable, no treaty recovery author. Inside a forgotten listening station, buried under the ruins of Dominion outpost Varnock, a half-crushed signal repeater continued trying to loop emergency broadcast. The Earth's message overrode it effortlessly, bleeding into the station's last operational speakers in a whisper that clawed its way along broken cables and half-fused circuits. "You mocked our scout, now your empire is dust." The voice of a dead world answered only with wind screaming through empty hallways, carrying ash, dust, and fragments of lost banners. In orbit, the debris field, once fragmented chaos, had begun forming a slow ring of silent wreckage around the dead planet, a grim monument carved by patient, unseen hands. No ceremony would mark its formation. No living witness would speak of its origin. The Terran command platform completed its post-action sweeps without comment, Operators filed away final sector reports into deep archives beneath encrypted locks. Review not scheduled, inquiry not permitted. Orwenthal's reflection on the viewport was lean, distant, framed by the collapsing ruins of an empire that never understood the patient fury sleeping inside Earth's treaties. He pressed a final command node embedded beneath the command rail. Across the sector's ruined satellites and collapsed outposts, the Earth emblem dissolved into blankness. No trace remained, only the wreckage, the empty wind, the fading radiation of burnt cores. Corvass stepped forward, voice carefully neutral, sector sweep complete, no remaining operational grids. Thal nodded once, a sharp, silent gesture. In the operations bay, atmospheric recyclers purged ambient energy traces, scrubbing away the last sense of heated systems. Cooling vents hissed low against the floor, whispering finality through the sterile air. Orwenthal turned from the viewport. His boots echoed lightly against the reinforced plating, the sound the only heartbeat left amid the machinery of erasure. Earth did not linger where its work was finished. No banners planted, no declarations shouted, no monuments raised. The dead spoke enough. Long after the observation station systems powered down, long after the Terran operators moved on to other silent theaters, Dominion ruins drifted through cold space. Drifting, empty, forgotten by all but those who would dare consider Earth weak again. And in the far reaches of the galactic network, on encrypted channels long dormant, one silent update, rippled outward, carried on backbones Earth's engineers had seeded long ago. Sector Vedra, absorbed, Terran protocol, complete compliance achieved. Across forgotten colonies, on stations untouched by the disaster, the faint whisper of what happened began to crawl through rumor and fear. No one spoke Earth's name aloud. They didn't have to. They only glanced toward the dark corner of the star map where an entire empire had once existed, and now existed no more. Dust and echoes. Nothing else. Nothing would ever rise there again.